All rise. Veuillez vous lever. The Special Tribunal for Lebanon is now in session. L'audience du Tribunal spécial pour le Liban est ouverte. Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir.
An order for photography has been made. Good morning, court officer, can you please call the case?
Good morning. Thank you, Your Honor. The Special Tribunal for Lebanon is sitting in an open session in the Prosecutor versus Ayyash, Badreddine, Onaisi, and Sabra, case number STL 1101.
Good morning to everybody. We are sitting here today to hear the prosecutor's opening statement. So can we please have appearances for the parties, starting with the prosecutor, Mr. Farrell.
Thank you, Mr. President, Your Honors, learned counsel, the rest of the persons in the courtroom, including the victims and the families of the victims. Good morning. Norman Farrell, appearing on behalf of the prosecution's office, and with me is Ms. Jocelyn Tabé, the deputy prosecutor, Mr. Graham Cameron, Mr. Alexander Milne, Mr. Eckhart Withup, as well assisting today is Ms. Alyssa Hines-Reimer, Ms. Marie-Sophie Poulin, Mr. Dorit Besharawi, Ms. Antoinette Issa, and our case manager to my right is Ms. Sky Winner. Thank you, Your Honor.
And could we have appearances for the legal representatives for the victims, please?
Your Honour, yes, the victims participating in the proceedings are represented here today by myself, Peter Haynes, my two co-representatives, Nada Abdel Satta Abu Samra and Mohammed Matar, and we are assisted in court by Kinga Tiburi and Tamara Kosic.
And for the defence?
Good morning. Eugene O'Sullivan, Emil Aoun, Deirdre Montgomery, Chad Mayer, and Jason Antley. We represent the interests of Mr. Ayyash.
Yes, my name is Antoine Coquemaz, lead counsel defending the interests of Mr. Badreddine, with my co-counsels here, Mr. John Jones, Mr. Ian Edwards, my legal advisor, Ms. Pauline Baronez, and case manager, Ms. Sarah Kode. Thank you.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président.
Yes, President, Your Honours, we are three counsels defending the interests of Mr. Onaisi, my colleague Yasser Hassan from the Egyptian bar, my colleague Philippe La Rochelle from the Quebec bar, myself, Vincent Courcelabrousse from the Paris bar. We have been given the assistance of Modsariev, Daniel Maburu, Artemis Chagisravou, and Sarah Murphy and Amin Abed Ali.
Your Honours, good morning. My name is David Young. I appear for Assad Sabra, along with my co-counsel, Dr. Ganel Metro and Mr. Jeffrey Roberts. We are assisted today by Mr. Eric Tully, case manager, by Mr. Julien Metton, assistant case manager, and by Ms. Bettina Spilker. Thank you.
And we have an appearance for the defence office.
Bonjour, Monsieur le
Mr. President, distinguished members of the bench, Your Honours, the Office of Defence this morning is represented by Ms. Roula Derbas from the Bar of Tripoli in Lebanon, Mr. Yoran Soufi, Legal Officer, Ms. Paula Lynch, Case Manager, and Ms. Hélène Ognac, my assistant, and myself, Mr. François Roux, Head of the Defence Office. And let me point out to the Chamber that I am representing in these hearings the Council of Defence of Mr. Meri Aouni, Jack Ali from Beirut. They are both here in the gallery. And I shall be saying a few words by the leave of the bench later on.
Thank you, Mr. Roux. Today, we will start to hear the prosecutor's opening statement. But before we do, I'd first welcome Judge Lettieri, sitting to my left, to these proceedings. He is sitting with us for the first time today. Having been sworn in just yesterday evening in the ceremony in this court. I also note that we are sitting in the Antonio Cassese courtroom, which commemorates the memory of the late president of this special tribunal. But before hearing from the prosecutor, I wish to say a few introductory things about these proceedings. The indictment charges each of the four accused, that's Mr. Salim Jamil Ayyash, Mr. Mustafa Amin Badruddin, Mr. Hussein Hassan Onisi, and Mr. Assad Hassan Sabra, with four crimes contrary to Lebanese law. The charges all arise out of the explosion in Beirut on the 14th of February 2005 that killed the former Lebanese Prime Minister, Mr. Rafik Hariri, and 21 others, and injured over 200 people. The charges are of conspiracy to commit a terrorist act, committing a terrorist act by using explosive materials, premeditated intentional homicide by using explosive materials, and attempted premeditated intentional homicide by using explosive materials. In a few moments, I will ask our court officer to read out a short summary of the charges in the indictment. After the accused had been indicted, we, the trial chamber, we held a hearing to decide whether we could proceed to a trial in absentia. We decided that each of the four accused had absconded or otherwise could not be found, and that all reasonable steps had been taken to secure their appearance before this tribunal and to inform them of the charges. After satisfying ourselves of this, we then decided to proceed to trial in absentia. Experienced defence counsel were immediately appointed to represent the four accused in their absence. We are told that the prosecutor intends to call hundreds of witnesses in this trial and to present thousands of exhibits. Each of the four accused, as you heard a moment ago when the appearances were taken, are represented by three assigned counsel and a legal team who have spent a considerable amount of time preparing to defend the four accused at trial, including doing their own extensive defence investigations. As the four accused have not had an initial appearance at this tribunal, either in person or by video link, no pleas of guilty or not guilty have been entered on their behalf, but they are presumed in law to be innocent. Under Article 3 of the Special Tribunal Statute, which it reflects the principles of international human rights law, the accused are presumed innocent until proven guilty. The onus is on the prosecutor to prove their guilt, and to convict the accused, the trial chamber must be convinced of the guilt of the accused beyond reasonable doubt. Now, these principles are fundamental to these proceedings. We will be proceeding as if the accused were present in the courtroom and had pleaded not guilty to the charges. During the trial, the defence counsel may question all of the witnesses against their accused, or witnesses called by the chamber for the participating victims. They may put evidence before the court, and they may call their own witnesses. This court, we emphasise, will rigorously enforce the fundamental rights of the accused to a fair trial. The order in which we will proceed in the coming weeks will be the following. We will start with the prosecutor's opening statement today, which we are told will go until sometime tomorrow. Then, the lawyers representing the participating victims in the case will give their opening statement. There are 65 participating victims in this trial, and they are represented by Mr. Haynes and his team. A participating victim is a person who has suffered physical, material or mental harm as a direct result of an attack falling within the tribunal's jurisdiction. The 65 participating victims include people who were themselves injured in the explosion and others who lost family members. They may, through their counsel, Mr. Haynes, put evidence before the court, including having witnesses called to give evidence. Their legal representatives may also question prosecution and defence witnesses. After the opening statements for the participating victims, we will then move to hear opening statements from counsel representing two of the accused, namely Mr. Badruddin and Mr. Onisi. We are informed that counsel for the other two accused will not make opening statements. But just before hearing the two defence statements, we will allow the head of the Defence Office, Mr. Roux, to make a brief statement, which he referred to a moment ago, concerning the rights of a fifth accused who is not a party to this trial. We are told that the defence opening statements will take several hours, so we anticipate the opening statements should be finished by next Tuesday at the latest. The opening statements will be made in the three official languages of the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, that is Arabic, French and English. These court proceedings will be conducted in those three languages with simultaneous interpretation into the three as we sit. After the opening statements are concluded, we will then move to hear the prosecution's first court witnesses, probably next Wednesday, and then continue with the other oral evidence to be called and receive into evidence the first set of prosecution exhibits, documents, records, etc. The trial chamber will also issue written guidelines later today for the administrative conduct of these proceedings. As the accused are not participating in person in the proceedings, we can't have the indictment in full read to them. However, I will ask our court officer to read out a summary of the charges in the indictment.
Thank you, Your Honor. Count 1. Charges all four accused with conspiracy aimed at committing a terrorist act under Articles 188, 212, 213, 270, and 314 of the Lebanese Criminal Code. Articles 6 and 7 of the Lebanese law of 11 January 1958, and Article 3, 1A of the Statute of the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. Mr. Mustafa Amin Badruddin and Mr. Salim Jamil Ayyash are alleged to have been members of this conspiracy between 11 November 2004 and the morning of 14 February 2005. Mr. Hussein Hassan Onaisi and Mr. Assad Hassan Sabra are alleged to have been members of this conspiracy between 22nd December 2004 and the morning of 14 February 2005. On counts 2 to 5, Mr. Badreddine and Mr. Ayyash are jointly charged as co-perpetrators. And on counts 6 to 9, Mr. Onaisi and Mr. Sabra are charged as accomplices in relation to the following criminal acts under the Lebanese Criminal Code, the Lebanese Law of 1958, and the Statute of the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. Committing a terrorist act by means of an explosive device on 14 February 2005 at Rue Munet El Wassin, Beirut, Lebanon, resulting in the death of Rafik Hariri and 21 other persons, and the partial destruction of the Saint Georges Hotel and nearby buildings, count 2 and 6, the intentional homicide of Rafik Hariri with premeditation by using explosive materials on 14 February 2005, count 3 and 7, the intentional homicide of 21 persons, in addition to the intentional homicide of Rafik Hariri, with premeditation by using explosive materials on 14 February 2005, or subsequently as a result of injuries sustained on 14 February 2005, count 4 and 8, and the attempted intentional homicide of 226 persons with premeditation by using explosive materials on 14 February 2005, count 5 and 9.
I'd now like to move to the prosecutor's opening statement. Mr. Farrell.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. O, Your Honour, if I could just address the court with your leave.
Mr. Rui, I think you heard a few moments ago that the order which we have adopted would be for the prosecutor to address the court with his opening statement, followed by the legal representatives of the victims, and then you can make the statement you foreshadowed. Farrell.
Mr. Roux, this is just a question of proceedings. We're not in the right proceedings. I believe I need to present my express reservations before any address of the merits. This is why this needs to be done according to the procedures. According to the Lebanese proceedings, express reservations need to be made before addressing the substance of the case, the merits of the case. And of course, we are following Lebanese proceedings.
Thank you, Mr. Roux. As indicated a few moments ago, we will hear your remarks at the close of the prosecutor's opening statement. The prosecutor's opening statement is a summary of the evidence or the case he wishes to present in this trial. Please proceed, Mr. Farrell.
Thank you, Your Honor. No one in Lebanon could fail to be affected, directly or indirectly, by the attack that took place in downtown Beirut on the 14th of February 2005, which killed 22 people, including Mr. Rafik Hariri, the former Prime Minister of Lebanon, and injured scores of other victims. The attack captured the attention of the world, its effect reverberating long after the explosion subsided. The people of Lebanon have the right to have this trial, to hear the evidence, and to seek the truth. To seek the truth, to reveal the identity of perpetrators who operated covertly and attempted to hide their true identities, to penetrate the veil covering this crime, will require detailed evidence. Despite the perpetrators' efforts to conceal their involvement in this attack, the truth leaves its traces. The evidence, including a considerable amount of telecommunications data, records the marks left behind, revealing the activities, communications, and true identities of the perpetrators. The communications evidence presents the blueprint of how the crime was committed and by whom. Mustafa Badruddin, Salim Ayyash, Hussein Anesi, and Asad Sabra, as the evidence will show, conspired together with others to commit this terrorist act aimed at assassinating the former Prime Minister of Lebanon, Mr. Rafi Hariri. The accused Badruddin and Ayyash with others prepared and carried out the attack on the 14th of February. The accused Anesi and Sabra assisted them as accomplices. The evidence will show that at 12:55 p.m. on February 14, 2005, as the convoy of former Prime Minister Rafi Hariri drove past the St. George Hotel, a suicide bomber detonated high-grade explosives equivalent to approximately 2,500 to 3,000 kilograms of TNT, concealed in the cargo area of a Mitsubishi Canter van. The explosion killed Mr. Hariri and other victims instantly and caused such extensive injuries to some that a few victims would succumb to their injuries the next day or weeks following the attack. As can be seen, I've asked that an image be brought up on screen. As can be seen from this photograph taken on the day of the explosion, the devastation and carnage was immense. This picture, taken shortly after the attack, is taken towards the southeast direction, facing the oncoming convoy. The crater is in the middle of the picture, slightly in front of the people and the fire truck that are visible. The remains of the vehicle which carried Rafi Hariri can be seen on fire in the bottom right of the picture. Outside the frame of the picture to the left would be the St. George Hotel. This photograph was also taken at around the same time as the previous photograph. It was taken from the same direction, facing the oncoming convoy. The burning car towards the back of the picture in the middle would be the fifth car in the convoy of 6 cars. One of the many victims of that attack, Mr. Yahya Mustafa al-Arab, was traveling in the 4th car of the convoy directly behind the former Prime Minister's vehicle. Evidence will show that this car was directly in line with the impact of the explosion. This photograph shows what could be identified as the remains of the first 5 cars of the convoy lined up in their order. The 5 cars are identified and will be referred to by numbers 401 to 405. The 6th car, though not in the picture, will be numbered 406. The red circle in the photograph identifies the parts which could be forensically identified as coming from the 4th car, which carried Mr. al-Arab. This is a close-up of the previous picture, showing more clearly those parts which could be identified as belonging to the 4th car, and showing that the car in which Mr. al-Arab was riding was obliterated. The evidence will show that some of its parts were found on the opposite side of the explosion site, on the ground floor or upper floors of the Byblos building. Mr. al-Arab, a father, an uncle, and a grandfather, could only be identified by his partial remains. On that day, a 20-year-old Lebanese student, Ms. Ala Hassan Osfor, happened to come to Beirut that day looking for a job. She traveled 1.5 hours from her hometown. After meeting her cousin, Ms. Daman, they went to the center of Beirut to the offices of an engineering company where Ms. Osfor was hoping to find work. She and her cousin had the tragic misfortune to be passing through the area at the moment the suicide bomber detonated the explosives. Both were killed instantly. Another victim in the convoy, Mr. Basil Farid Fulahan, a member of the Lebanese parliament, was traveling in the same car as the former prime minister. He initially survived the explosion, but died 2 months later as a result of his injuries. Senior Trial Counsel Mr. Milne will address you after I'm completed in more detail about the events of the day and the tragic killing of the 22 murder victims, as well as the injuries inflicted on many other victims. Evidence will show that the explosive blast was of such a magnitude that it left a crater of 9 to 12 meters in diameter. This photograph was taken on the day of the explosion, with the crater directly in the foreground. The St. George Hotel would be directly behind the person taking this photograph. This photograph was also taken on the day of the explosion and provides the ability for the court to see its size relative to other objects and persons in the picture. The explosion caused serious structural damage to the St. George Hotel, as can be seen from this photograph taken of the hotel on the 18th of February 2005, 4 days after the attack. The explosion also completely shattered windows at a distance of 300 meters from the blast. The crime took place in the middle of the day, in a street full of people, in the downtown center of the capital city of Lebanon. The attack targeted one of the most important political figures in Lebanon, the former prime minister. The attackers killed innocent bystanders, a student, a hotel worker, a cousin, a father, a brother, a daughter, friends. It is not that the perpetrators simply did not care if they killed their fellow citizens, rather they intended to do so. The attackers used an extraordinary quantity of high-grade explosives, far more than was required to kill their main target. Clearly, their aim was not only to ensure that the target was killed, but to send a terrifying message and to cause panic among the population of Beirut and Lebanon. Crimes of this nature are not simply a matter of the local affairs of those impacted in downtown Beirut that day. The crimes affect all of us and the Lebanese people, as they offend our principles of human rights and of humanity. This act led to a call for accountability and a call for a tribunal with an international dimension. The evidence will show that the four accused, Mustafa Badruddin, Salim Ayyash, Hussein Unessi, and Assad Sabra, will be proven accountable for these crimes on the basis of their individual criminal responsibility under the law applied by this tribunal. The evidence will show that Mustafa Badruddin monitored and, together with Ayyash, coordinated a number of steps to prepare the attack, such as the extensive surveillance of the former prime minister for approximately 3 months leading up to the attack. Badruddin also monitored the physical perpetration of the attack on February 14th through his contact on that day with Ayyash, who was on the ground leading the team carrying out the final acts for the assassination. In addition, Badruddin, together with a co-conspirator, Hassan Meri, monitored and coordinated the preparation for the false claim of responsibility for the attack. The evidence will show that Ayyash organized and coordinated the physical surveillance of the former prime minister, as well as other activities such as the purchase of the Mitsubishi Canter van, which was used in the attack. Ayyash was on the ground in downtown Beirut on February 14th in the hour and minutes leading up to the attack, coordinating its implementation. Sabra and Onesi, with a co-conspirator, participated in identifying a suitable individual, later identified as Ahmed Abu Adas, who was to be used to make a videotaped claim of responsibility for the attack. Onesi took steps to lure Abu Adas, met with him, and falsely presented himself as a person named Mohammed. Immediately following the attack, Onesi and Sabra took steps to disseminate statements falsely attributing responsibility for the attack and ensured delivery and broadcast as the false claim of responsibility which featured Abu Adas. This case against the accused will be complex and the evidence will be detailed, as specific aspects of the evidence will be explored in depth. The prosecution intends to rely on the testimony of fact witnesses who will appear both in this courtroom and by video link, and on witness evidence submitted in written form. Other forms of evidence include substantial expert evidence, cellular telephone communications data, closed-circuit television recordings, photographs, maps, and other documentary evidence. The evidence to be presented in trial falls into three general categories. First, the evidence concerning the attack itself on February 14, 2005. This will be detailed by Senior Trial Counsel Mr. Milne. The evidence will include the nature and method of the attack, the identities of those killed and injured, the devastation to the area, including the buildings, the nature of the vehicle used as the instrument of the attack, the nature and quantity of explosives, the movement and location of the Canter van, the DNA remains recovered from these scenes and the identities of such remains, the forensic and other expert conclusions arising from the investigation. Second, evidence of the preparatory acts of the four accused and their co-conspirators in 2004 and 2005 for the attack will be set out, as explained in detail by Senior Trial Counsel Mr. Cameron. The evidence will show that the attack was prepared significantly in advance. The accused, with others, carried out a number of covert preparatory steps designed to execute the attack in a manner which would conceal the identity of the real perpetrators and leave behind a false trail that would point to others. This false trail was intended to mislead the investigation and the Lebanese people. These preparatory steps included the establishment of a closed telephone network for exclusive communication between three people, Badruddin, Ayyash, and Merai. They also included the establishment and use of other telephone networks, including those by Ayyash and the other co-perpetrators for surveillance and for use on the ground in carrying out the attack. Thirdly, there is a network used by Sabra Onesi and their co-conspirator to prepare a false claim of responsibility and to ensure its broadcast. The evidence will show through this telephone use the development of the surveillance of the former Prime Minister. The evidence will demonstrate the initial occasional surveillance of Rafi Kariri, which changed to the point where the former Prime Minister was under surveillance on virtually every day he was in the country from the end of December 2004 until minutes before the assassination on the 14th of February 2005. The covert nature of the telephone networks, the extensive efforts made to conceal their users, the intensity, detail, and extent of surveillance, its repetitive pattern, and the fact that three of the telephone networks used by the accused all shut down at or immediately after the assassination demonstrate that the acts of the accused are not random, coincidental, or innocent. The evidence revealing the stages of the preparation over this 4-month period will show the involvement of one or more of the accused in the following preparatory steps: the establishment and use of a group of telephones in accordance with a protocol designed to ensure the secretive nature of their use and their users, the identification of a location to carry out the attack, the gathering of sufficient information on the daily movements of Rafi Kariri to plan for the attack at the preferred location, the activation on January 4th, 2005 of a closed network of telephones that were to be used for the final days of surveillance and to carry out the attack on the day, the purchase of the Mitsubishi Canter van on January 25th, 2005, which was used to deliver the explosives on the day of the attack, the recruitment of Abu Adas in December 2004 and early January 2005, a 22-year-old Palestinian man who was then used to falsely claim responsibility for the assassination on behalf of a group that has not as far as the evidence shows, existed before and has never been heard from again. The purchase on or about February 10th of the telephone card used on February 14th to call Al Jazeera and Reuters from the payphones in downtown Beirut in relation to the false claim of responsibility. The preparation for the attack, including the steps necessary to ensure the broadcast by the media of the false claim of responsibility. And the final preparations on February 14th, including intense surveillance of Hariri and the coordinated placement of the Cantor van into position for that attack. Third, the identity of the four accused, thereby showing their respective roles, will be referred to by Mr. Cameron and will be set out in greater detail, of course, during the trial. The evidence demonstrating the identity of the accused is, to a large extent, dependent on the very tools they themselves used, the telephones. The accused were fully aware of the risk that telephone use could reveal their identity and their activities. Thus, they took considerable steps to use the telephones in a covert manner and under false names or no names. But their use of these covert network telephones in conjunction with other telephones in their possession reveal the accused as the users of these telephones and thereby their involvement of the crimes. The evidence which shows that the telephones used in connection with the attack were in the hands of Badruddin, Ayyash, Onesi, and Sabra includes fact and expert evidence, telephone records, SMS content, and other evidence. The evidence will show that Badruddin used a total of 13 mobile telephones over a long span of time, from 1997 until 2009. One of these was the covert network telephone used in the commission of the attack by Badruddin in the fall of 2004 until the hour of the attack on February 14th. Ayyash used a total of 11 telephones. They include landlines, personal mobile telephones, and 4 covert network telephones used in relation to the attack. Factual evidence will be presented to ascribe the personal telephones to an accused. Analytical evidence will be presented to show that the relationship between the use of the personal telephone and the covert network telephone is sufficient to support the conclusion that the user of the two telephones is a single person. This telephone co-location evidence will be presented in relation to the accused, specifically Badruddin and Ayyash. The telephones used by Onesi and Sabra were used both to communicate amongst themselves and their co-conspirator for the purpose of furthering the conspiracy, but also for personal matters. A combination of witness testimony, documents, contacts made to other telephones, geographic location of the phones, and SMS content will place the telephone used for aiding and abetting the crimes in the hands of the accused Onesi and Sabra. A few final comments in conclusion before I ask Mr. Milne to continue. Despite the deliberate refusal and the failure of the accused to appear to face their trial, and regardless of the charges against them, the accused are presumed innocent. And their rights, including their right to a defense through the defense counsel present, are respected. The determination of their guilt or innocence will be decided on the basis of the law and the evidence, with the burden clearly resting on the prosecution. The evidence will demonstrate that this burden has been met. The case against the accused, as will be outlined in greater detail, is built on a number of different strands of evidence, understood in their relationship to each other and in their totality. Each reinforces the other. It is the numerous pieces of reinforcing evidence, including the indelible traces which the accused could not erase, when taken together, lead in the prosecution's submission beyond reasonable doubt to the conclusion that each of the four accused carried out the acts attributed to them and are guilty of the crimes charged. Thank you for your attention. With your leave, I invite you to listen closely to Senior Trial Counsel Mr. Milne who will outline in more detail the evidence concerning the events of February 14th, and he will be followed by Mr. Cameron. Thank you.
Mr. Milne.
May it please Your Honours. The Beirut terrorist bombing of 14th February 2005 shocked the people of Lebanon and the rest of the world. Initial outrage and horror gave way to a firm determination to establish what had happened and to find out who was responsible. The investigative work of the first hours and days by the Lebanese authorities, assisted later by teams from many other nations, was to result in the gradual revelation of the planning and perpetration of the crime, and eventually the identities of the terrorists involved. In the course of this opening, we shall seek to describe in outline the lead-up to the assassination of former Prime Minister Rafi Hariri and 21 other people, and the attempted murder of many more. We shall trace the origins of the attack back through the months to identify the planning, the surveillance, the preparations, and the organisation of what was clearly a determined and ruthless assault upon peace and democracy in Lebanon. We start, however, as did the first investigators, with the events of the day. We shall set out those matters that can be identified and learnt from the scene of the crime and its aftermath. We shall also trace the path of the investigations over the following months as fact after fact emerged. And we shall identify what has been learnt since then through expert analysis. Former Prime Minister Rafi Hariri, having started his day at the Karatim Palace, spent the latter part of the morning of Monday, 14th February 2005, attending a session of Parliament in Beirut. The Parliament building is on Nejmi Place. His arrival at about 10:54 a.m. and his movements within the building were recorded by several photographers and on video footage. He appeared to have been in cheerful good spirits. He arrived with his friend and colleague, Basil Flehan, whom we see on the left of this picture. We also see, left to right, Mr. Hariri's security detail. Mohammed Dia, Tal al-Nasser, wearing sunglasses, and Yahya al-Arab. They entered the building, and Mr. Hariri spent some time in the chamber meeting and talking with colleagues, including Bassam El-Sabeh. This photograph, in fact, assisted in establishing the actual time of the visit, because the wristwatch of the gentleman in front of him, now highlighted, is visible. Indeed, so, as we move on to the next shot, is that of Mr. Hariri. Whilst there, and amongst others, Mr. Hariri spoke with Marwan Hamadeh and Bahia Hariri. His time of arrival is further confirmed by the records of telephone calls which were made by his security detail, who were with him at both locations, that is Karatim and Parliament. And he remained within the building until nearly 12 noon. As he left the Parliament building, he spoke briefly with politician Fares Boué, as Mr. Boué was entering Parliament. And before leaving the area, we know that Mr. Hariri made an unplanned diversion when he stepped across the road to the Place de l'Étoile Café, and he engaged in conversations with a group of women who were outside. This was at about 11:56 a.m. The timings of Mr. Hariri's movements will become of much greater significance in the course of the case, as the patterns of other activity, unseen activity, in the form of surveillance by his eventual murderers, is revealed. At almost exactly the same time as he stood outside the cafe, we know that a white van drove through the President Sleiman Frangieh tunnel. The van is caught on successive cameras as it travels from south to north towards the Saint-Georges area. We see this same van on camera 1, 1 second later on camera 2, and again on camera 2. 4 seconds later, it appears on camera 3. 5 seconds after that on camera 4, and 2 seconds on camera 5, before exiting the tunnel 7 seconds later at camera 6. As it emerged from that tunnel, it pulled to the right-hand side and out of sight. Subsequent analysis showed that whilst the camera timings for the tunnel are consistent one with another, they're not precisely right, but by comparison of later footage from camera 6, which shows the effects of the explosion, it's possible to establish that the camera times, that is, the times we see on those pictures, were approximately 1 minute and 54 seconds behind real time. The exit from the tunnel emerges facing the marina between the Phoenicia Hotel and the Monroe Hotel. A later photograph from near the marina shows the reverse view, and we move closer up to that. One sees the tunnel exit. This van would have turned right across the face of the Monroe Hotel, which we see in that picture, and it then disappeared from view. The prosecution will submit that the unexpected change of plan by Mr. Hariri, by which I mean going into the cafe, resulted in the need for the assassination plan to be put on hold at short notice until such time as he renewed his journey. Mr. Hariri, having gone into the cafe at about noon, remained inside, and apart from stepping outside for a brief conversation at about 12:15, he stayed there until 12:49. He then walked out into the street with his security detail and with Mr. Flehan, and they returned to the vehicles. These pictures which show Mr. Hariri with his bodyguards are also some of the final photos that we have, which show Mr. Flehan, Mr. Nasser. We see Mr. Darwish, third from the left, his face circled there, and Mr. Galliini in the next photo on the right-hand side. Mr. Hariri chose to drive his own car accompanied by Basil Flehan. And the photos which we have of Mr. Hariri in the moments before he entered his car are the last ones taken of him alive. As he waves to say goodbye in this picture, one can also see the ambulance highlighted behind, which would form the final convoy vehicle in the background to the right. The time of his departure is shown in the following photograph by the clock in the center of Nejmi Place on his windscreen. That image, in fact, when cropped, turned and reversed, indicates that he left at approximately 10 minutes to 1. Mr. Hariri was to return from Parliament to the Cretan Palace, and the route selected was to be north from Parliament along Foch Street and then west along the coastal road, passing the Phoenicia Hotel and the Saint Georges Hotel. The convoy which was to accompany Mr. Hariri consisted of 5 vehicles. We have here a graphic setting them out. His car was an armour-plated Mercedes S600, and it was to be the third in the convoy. The lead vehicle was a Toyota Land Cruiser VXR. This is now designated for our purposes as Vehicle 401. It was driven by Hussein Diab, travelling with Maha Daouk, Mohidin Manaimne, and Mahmoud El Jamal. All 4 are members of the ISF. The second vehicle, which we call Vehicle 402, was an escort vehicle, which was a Mercedes S500, driven by Ahmed Shahade, travelling with Mohammed Dia and Hassan El Ajouz. Each of those men was a civilian bodyguard for Mr. Hariri. As I've said, Mr. Hariri's car was third in the convoy, and hence it's known as 403. He was accompanied, as I've mentioned, by Basil Flehan. The following 2 cars, our vehicles 404 and 405, were both Mercedes S500s. Vehicle 404 was driven by Mohammed Darwish, travelling with Yahya Al-Arab and Tal Al-Nasser. Vehicle 405 was driven by Ziad Taraf, travelling with Mohammed Galayini and Omar Mazeri. Each of these 6 men was also a bodyguard to Mr. Hariri. Vehicles 402, 404 and 405, those being the 1 car ahead of Mr. Hariri's and the 2 cars behind him, were each fitted with equipment designed to cancel out mobile phone signals, phone jammers, as they will be referred to. And these were specific counter-bomb measures to prevent the remote detonation of explosive devices by use of mobile phones. We shall return to these at a later stage. The final car in the convoy was a Chevrolet Suburban. This was fitted out as an ambulance and for medical transport. The vehicle, 406, was dark blue. All the other vehicles in the convoy, in fact, were black. Vehicle 406 was driven by Mohammed Waini, who was with Mazen Zahabi and Rashid Hamoud. The route to be taken by the convoy had been communicated to Maha Daouk, who was in the lead vehicle, a few minutes before the departure by bodyguard Tal Al-Nasser. And from Nejmi Place, it travelled towards the Maritime Road, Ain Marissa, and towards the Saint Georges Hotel. An aerial view of Beirut, taken sometime after the event, in fact shows Nejmi Palace as the centre of a complex of streets to the top of this photograph, and the Saint Georges by the marina on the bottom left. From Nejmi Place, taking a more close-up view, the convoy went towards the sea, and we have there traced out the route taken. Before it followed the road down to the marina and skirted around the marina. The tunnel exit, which was described earlier, can be seen on the same photograph, and one sees it marked there to the right. As the convoy headed in that direction, a careful viewing of the final camera from the President Suleiman Frangieh tunnel shows what appears to be a white van moving from right to left in the direction of the Saint-Georges. But more clearly, camera 7 of the Phoenicia Hotel, angled across the road at right angles to the tunnel, also shows a white van, believed to be the same one that had previously been seen in the tunnel. The van is moving towards the Saint-Georges. Later film from the same camera was to show the effects of the explosion occurring. And again, this enabled investigators to determine that the clock on the face of the camera was fast by approximately 47 minutes and 48 seconds. So the time, the true time of this photo, was 12:51 and 26 seconds. And finally, the same van is picked up by a camera attached to the front of the HSBC Bank building, looking in the direction of the Saint-Georges and covering the westerly movement of traffic along Minat al-Husni Street. A photo of the HSBC on the left-hand side of this picture, which was taken sometime later, shows that it is side-on to the Saint-Georges, and one sees at the top of the picture the Saint-Georges flagged, as is the Byblos building, the HSBC, the white building on the left. I might pause for a moment. This picture appears to have been taken from probably the Monroe building, Monroe Hotel. The camera with which we're concerned looks across the face of the HSBC in the direction of the Saint-Georges, and this is camera 15. I'm going to ask now that we switch from the presentation to a camera shot of the model in the middle of the room. This is camera shot 1. This, the model that we see in front of us, pre-blast. And one sees there the HSBC building, the triangular area of grass in front. And on the very right of this camera shot, one sees the edge of the Saint-Georges building and the longer pink strip, the edge of the Byblos building. Therefore, it is an oblique angle to the left as one stands with the HSBC behind. Thank you. If we can switch back, please, to the presentation. Video film from that CCTV has been studied. We show here the first in a series of stills taken from that film. This first frame shows the white van moving right to left on the road behind the central lamppost. That road is Rue Minat al-Husni Street, which runs and leads between the Saint-Georges and the incomplete Byblos building. The man emerging from the car on the bottom right-hand side of this picture, I say straight away, has no known connection at all with this case. In this frame and in the next, we'll see that he gets out of his car and simply walks towards the bank. But his movements provide a useful comparison for us, because in the following two frames, if we can move on, the white van moves a relatively short distance in the same time that that man takes to leave his vehicle, to close the door, and to walk away out of sight. An indication, the prosecution say, of the van moving very slowly towards the Saint-Georges and heading to the left out of sight. Is that 42? Yeah. At the point where the camera loses sight of it, the white van is moving directly towards the point of the explosion, which would be a matter of but a few yards further on. We then see a series of other unrelated vehicles passing along the road, clearly moving faster than the white van, and these in each case caught by the camera. We then see, again as a point of reference, a yellow truck which moves across and is then followed moments later by the convoy. We see the vehicles, in fact, most clearly as they pass to the gap on the left of the picture. And we see there vehicle 401, the Land Cruiser, vehicle 402, vehicle 403, vehicle 404, 405, and finally 406, the ambulance. The next instant, the camera is obscured by the force of the blast. From later analysis of the film, it's been assessed that the van passed through the field of vision of the camera between 12:52 and 36 seconds and 12:53 and 17 seconds. The movement of the van from right to left as it was viewed by the camera was picked up on 30 separate frames of film, whereas other vehicles travelling that same way tended to feature on only 3 to 5 frames. Again, this indicates the van was travelling very slowly at that point. The same camera, which picks out the arrival of the convoy vehicles, shows them at 12:54 and 57 seconds. Each of them passes the field of vision very quickly before the explosion, which was approximately 12:55 and 5 seconds. We go again, if we could please, to the crime scene model. If we could switch to the camera film. And this is camera shot 2. This, the camera looking at the post-blast model. The area into which all of the vehicles passed is the road between the Saint-Georges, which is the lower level, a more colourful building on the right-hand side as they advanced, and the Byblos building on the other side. The Saint-Georges was undergoing works at the time, and facing it, the Byblos building was incomplete, and it had a large construction crane in front of it, as any of us can see on both models. Traffic could pass in both directions. Based upon the position, as we see here, of the resulting crater in the road, the white van, the prosecution say, had moved to roughly a midway point along the front of the Saint-Georges, and the convoy was in the process of overtaking it when the detonation occurred. Thank you. If we can switch back, please, to the presentation. In Parliament, about 1 kilometre from the blast, the same politician to whom Mr. Hariri had spoken as he left, Mr. Faraz Boué, was addressing Parliament at the time. The clearly audible explosion and the shaking of the curtain behind him gives some indication of the physical shock engendered by the blast. Your Honour and the members of Council may be assisted by wearing your headphones at this stage. Can I also say, for the record, that Mr. Boué is making a speech, obviously in Arabic. I don't ask that this be translated. His words in this case are not relevant to the case.
كيف سيحسم وكيف سينظر إلى عملية التمويل الانتخابي. هل المساعدات التربوية هي رشوة أم لا؟ هل التوظيف هو رشوة أم لا؟ هل المساعدات الصحية هي رشوة أم لا؟ هل فعلا الخدمات عبر الدولة هي رشوة أم لا؟ شو انفجار؟
Subsequent analysis of earthquake detecting equipment some 15 kilometers away at Bahanas indicated there had been a sudden, violent shockwave. The same signal was picked up by the seismological station 60 kilometers away at Auca. Estimates of the precise time of the explosion were drawn from these observations, and they place it at approximately 3 to 5 seconds after 12:55, as mentioned earlier. The timing and the positioning of the van as a bomb some seconds before the explosion took place, the prosecution would submit, suggests that there was effectively no time for the driver to have left the van and to have reached any point of safety. This is consistent, we say, with the driver having been a suicide bomber. In addition, the timing of the bomb to explode precisely as the convoy passed indicated that the explosion was activated manually. There's no evidence to suggest that this could have been done remotely by wire. 3 of the 5 convoy vehicles carried equipment designed to jam mobile telephone signals precisely to avoid remote radio detonation of booby-trap bombs. Later examination of the surviving vehicle, that is vehicle 402, indicated that the jammer in that car was switched on and had been working. There's no evidence to suggest the equipment in the other 2 cars, which were destroyed, had not been. And finally, as we shall see in due course, DNA traces of an unknown man were found at the scene. That man was blown into tiny pieces. The total disintegration of his body is consistent with the fate sadly suffered by the 3 occupants of vehicle 404. They were a matter of feet from the explosion and the center of that explosion, and seemingly so was the unknown man. And the prosecution submits that it's a reasonable inference that this was the suicide bomber. The position of the explosion between the 2 buildings, the Saint-Georges and the Byblos, was, in the submission of the prosecution, no accident or coincidence. These 2 buildings provide a man-made canyon with walls either side, allowing for the concentration of the blast. And, as will be clear, the position of the explosion is identified by the resulting crater, which was approximately 12 meters in diameter. The carnage and destruction which resulted were immense. Not only would the sound of the explosion have been heard across the city, but the smoke from the flames would have been visible for miles around. One news cameraman filmed the scene as he approached around the marina, taking, in fact, the same road the convoy had ridden a few moments before. And again, members of court may wish to put on your headphones. Can we run that? What greeted him on arrival amounted to a man-made hell. In the centre of the road, ablaze, was the ambulance which had been at the rear of the convoy. If we could play, please, the next film. My learned friend Mr. Farrell indicated earlier that the photograph you saw during his presentation had been from the far end of the street. The film you see there is from the direction in which the convoy had approached. The first persons to the scene were numerous members of the public who ran forward to help who they could. And typical of the generous spirit of the Lebanese, they appear to have disregarded personal risk in their attempts to save lives or help the victims. Many of the injured persons were carried away, and we shall see photos of some of those injuries which people near the blast had sustained. Emergency services arrived on the scene soon afterwards. The immediate effect of the blast, apart from human carnage, was to toss motor vehicles around as if they were no more than toys. Multiple vehicles were fiercely ablaze, the fuel tanks ruptured, and thick smoke was obscuring any view, as we have seen. Debris was blown in every direction, including into the sea, and the buildings on either side sustained serious and significant damages. The firemen spent considerable time extinguishing the vehicle fires. Our understanding of these first few minutes is informed by the video and still photography of the aftermath, and many photographers and film cameramen who rushed to the scene were able to document the events even before the emergency services had arrived. Some of the scenes recorded are truly horrific and give insight into what effect the blast must have had on those who were present. Vehicle 401 had passed the centre of the explosion, as indeed had Vehicle 402. Convoy Vehicle 403, containing Mr. Hariri, was just past the centre, and Vehicle 404 was the closest to the bomb when it detonated. The force of the blast was such that Mr. Hariri was thrown from his car, and it's reasonable to conclude that he died quickly at the scene. Car 404 was totally obliterated, and car 405 was incinerated. The upshot was that all the occupants of vehicles 403, 404, and 405 died either at the scene or subsequently as a result of the injuries that they sustained. Mr. Flahan, who had been with Mr. Hariri, survived for several weeks before succumbing to his injuries on the 18th of April 2005. We see in this picture Vehicle 402, the second vehicle in the convoy, spun sideways in the middle of the road, viewed from the far end of the street, the southern end of the street. A small truck, also turned sideways, faces across the street. And behind that truck, we see the further vehicle on fire. This indeed is Vehicle 403 on the right-hand side, Mr. Hariri's car. One deceased victim, not a person from the convoy. That person lies nearby, tended to by passers-by, but it has to be said, already beyond assistance. And the devastation at the site is self-evident. Nearby, Mr. Hariri, already deceased, was covered by a blanket, having been pulled away from the blaze by those who ran to assist. Vehicle 405 was completely incinerated with its occupants. In the final car, the ambulance, 2 of the occupants left the vehicle, but the final occupant, Mazen Zahabi, was caught fully in the blast. For several minutes he was left in the burning vehicle, and only when he dragged himself alight from the car was it realized that he was alive but dreadfully burnt. He was carried from the scene, but he succumbed to his injuries and died later that night. In all, 7 members of Mr. Hariri's convoy entourage perished, in addition to Mr. Hariri and Mr. Flehan. The other 13 victims, 3 women and 10 men, were present at the scene and died as a result of the explosion. Many more were injured. Volunteers who ran forward to assist carried away those who were injured and tendered assistance at the scene. Ambulance personnel removed the remains of the deceased and treated the injured. The impact of such an attack goes far beyond the scene of the explosion. The anguish and horror written on the faces of those present and of those at the hospital premises when the bodies were taken there speaks volumes as to the human suffering inflicted by the blast. Those who died were victims. Those who were injured were victims. Their families were victims. And the Lebanese people as a whole were victims of this attack. The prosecution does not dispute that the preservation of the scene of the crime for forensic analysis took second place to the efforts of both the professionals and the non-professionals to render help. This is not meant at all as a criticism of the efforts being made at the time. Despite earlier experience of bombings, nothing could have prepared any of those caught in the incident for what they went through that day. The civil defense who attended provided ambulance transport, although several of the bodies removed from the scene were quite evidently deceased and beyond medical assistance. The body of Mr. Hariri was removed from the scene and it was identified by his personal physician. Due to the injuries sustained, his identification was confirmed by reference to his personal effects and his dental records. Mr. Flehan was taken from the scene severely injured. He was later flown to Paris for treatment, and as I've already said, he survived until the 18th of April before dying as a result of his injuries. The 3 bodies of Mohammed Galini, Ziad Taraf, and Omar Marseri were recovered from the shell of vehicle 405. Mr. Galini and Mr. Taraf were taken to the American University Hospital. Mr. Marseri was taken to the Hotel Dieu Hospital, and due to the near-total incineration of that vehicle, each was identified by reference to the DNA samples taken from close relatives. Mazen Zahabi, who had been seen stumbling from the convoy ambulance, was taken to the Rizq Hospital and later transferred to Jaitawi Hospital, but he survived only a few hours before he died of his injuries at 8 p.m. the same evening. His body was identified by a close relative. Zahi Rojali, who had been working at the Saint Georges Hotel, died later as a result of the explosion. His body was taken to the American University Hospital and it was identified by his brother. Mahmoud Al-Khalaf, who died, was brought to the American University Hospital. His body was dreadfully damaged and was identified only by DNA matches to close relatives. And the bodies of 2 cousins, both young women, Ala Asfour and Yamama Daman, were both taken to the American University Hospital. They were each visually identified by relatives, and they were 2 of the 3 women who died in the explosion. The third woman was named Rima Bazi. Her body was taken to the Al Makassed hospital, and she was also visually identified in this case by her father. The body of victim Joseph Owen was taken to the Al Makassed hospital and identified by his brother. And the body of Abdu Bufara taken to Zara Hospital, and visually identified by his family. The body of Rawad Haidar was taken to the Hotel Dieu Hospital and identified by relatives, and similarly the body of Sobi Al-Koda to the Hotel Dieu Hospital and identified by a friend. One victim, Haytham Othman, was taken alive to the same hospital, but he died there of his injuries the same evening at 11:30, and his body was handed over to his brother after visual identification. Due to the scenes of chaos at the point of the explosion, searches for the victims were vigorous but not wholly systematic. The body of victim Mahmoud Al-Mohammed was only recovered 1 week after the explosion, having been lodged by the explosion under a vehicle. It was taken to the American University Hospital, and it was only identified by means of DNA comparison with his father. And another deceased victim, Abdelhamid Galyini, whose disappearance had been reported by his family, his body was only discovered under rubble at the scene on the 2nd of March 2005, and again could only be identified by means of DNA comparison with close relatives. 3 of the members of Mr. Hariri's entourage, his security detail in car 404, were the closest to the explosion, and they suffered the most extensive devastation. Some small comfort may be derived from the fact that all 3 must have died instantaneously. The remains of Mohammed Darwish were recovered, but no complete bodies for Tal al-Nasser or Yahya al-Arab were found. Distressingly, for all concerned, the body of another victim, a Syrian national, Farhan al-Issa, was misidentified as being that of Tal al-Nasser, and it was released to Mr. Nasser's family for burial. At the same time, unidentified human remains were handed to the family of Yahya al-Arab for burial. But after subsequent DNA analysis demonstrated the error, both the body of Mr. Issa and the remains were handed to the al-Arab family were exhumed. Mr. al-Issa's body was then returned to his family. The remains formerly buried were tested and proved to be the remains of 6 separate persons, but ultimately only partial remains of Mr. Nasser and Mr. al-Arab were identified for burial by their family. The recovery of human remains was to continue over the course of more than a year, and in all, nearly 300 biological fragments were recovered from the crime scene. About 1/3 of those fragments, each very small in size, belonged to the one unknown and unidentified man. The devastating disintegration of his body, as I've already said, indicates he must have been very close indeed to the center of the blast when it occurred. Your Honor, I know that we are approaching the point where the court proposed to take a break, and that would perhaps be an appropriate time within the opening.
It would be appropriate, just, Mr. Court Officer, just hold for a moment. Yes, it would be an appropriate moment indeed, Mr. Milne. Can I just also indicate, if I overlooked saying this before, that in the court today, 8 participating victims are present in the court, and the chamber and, of course, everybody present in the courtroom understands any obvious distress they must be experiencing in listening to the details in the prosecutor's opening statement. So just one other matter which I wish to raise is that... Thank you, Mr. Milne. Thank you. Earlier, Mr. Roux said he'd be representing the interests of another accused person, Mr. Hassan Habib Meri. That's quite correct, and he'll be making a statement at an appropriate time. I just draw to the attention of everyone here that in a preliminary hearing in the Meri case 2 days ago, it's at page 44 of the transcript, the chamber not only allowed but invited counsel for Mr. Merai to be present in the courtroom as observers if they wish to be so. That's Mr. Aouni and his two co-counsel. The invitation is, of course, still there, and I can see that there is indeed room in the courtroom to accommodate them if they wish to come into the courtroom. The sitting hours today will be, we will break for half an hour now. We will resume at 11:30 and continue until 1. We'll then take a break and resume at 2:30 and sit today until 4. The court is adjourned for half an hour.
All rise. Veuillez vous lever.